Welcome to the Behind Story, where the wildest Karen encounters come to life. Get ready for jaw-dropping, hilarious, and downright unbelievable moments as Karens take entitlement to the next level. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a crazy story. Let's jump right in. Maplewood was the kind of town where time seemed to stand still. The manicured lawns, the picture-perfect houses, the quiet streets, it all painted an illusion of harmony, as if nothing unexpected could ever disrupt its pristine surface. It was the kind of place where people prided themselves on good manners and orderly routines, where neighborhood disputes were settled with passive-aggressive notes rather than outright confrontation. Officer Jake Carter had chosen this town for its supposed tranquility. After years of working in the city, dealing with the chaos of real crime gangs, drugs, violence, he wanted a change. He imagined himself handling the occasional parking violation, maybe responding to a lost pet report, and living a life free of adrenaline-fueled nights. But within weeks of his arrival, he realized Maplewood had its own brand of chaos, not the kind that made headlines, but the kind that thrived in the hushed corridors of homeowners associations and behind the tinted windows of high-end SUVs. They called themselves the Neighborhood Protection Group, but to the rest of Maplewood, they were known by a different name, the Karen Coalition, a force of entitled suburban warriors, wrapped in pastel cardigans and oversized sunglasses. They believed themselves to be the true authority in town. Laws were suggestions, rules were meant for other people, and actual law enforcement, an inconvenience to their self-appointed reign. At the head of this coalition was Patricia Whitmore. If Maplewood had royalty, she was its self-crowned queen. She carried herself with the unshakable confidence of a CEO, if that CEO's empire consisted of nosy housewives and Facebook conspiracy theories. Patricia had an opinion about everything: how people should park, which lawn decorations were acceptable, and, most importantly, how the police should do their jobs. And if things didn't go the way she wanted, well, she had a lawyer's number on speed dial and a personal army of outraged suburbanites ready to flood social media with cries of injustice. Her right-hand women were just as formidable. There was Linda, the self-appointed journalist, whose phone was always recording, waiting for her next viral moment. Any situation, no matter how mundane, was met with her signature shriek, "I'm recording this." Then there was Debbie, the gossip queen, who could twist a simple hello into a full-blown scandal by dinner. And finally, Susan, the group's legal expert, who based her legal knowledge entirely on things she had read in Facebook comment sections. Together, they formed an unrelenting force, a suburban nightmare that no one, not even law enforcement, could escape. Jake had encountered entitled people before, but the Karens of Maplewood were different. They weren't just difficult, they were relentless. Every day, it was something new: a complaint about how police were harassing law-abiding citizens, translation, issuing speeding tickets, an emergency call about suspicious activity, translation, a delivery driver existing, or a lecture on constitutional rights based on a half-baked internet post. But things were escalating. What had started as petty grievances had turned into something more. They had begun interfering with actual police work, questioning officers at traffic stops, showing up at crime scenes with their phones raised, demanding to be part of the process. And Patricia was growing bolder by the day. Jake had a feeling something big was coming. He just didn't know how bad it would get. Jake Carter had dealt with plenty of difficult people in his career. He'd been yelled at, threatened, even had a gun pulled on him once back in the city. But nothing could have prepared him for the relentless storm that was the Karen Coalition. It started with small, almost laughable incidents. Patricia and her squad seemed to take turns, finding new ways to push the limits of law enforcement patience. One day, Jake pulled over a teenager for running a stop sign, only to have Patricia storm into the station. Hours later, demanding he be reprimanded for harassing the youth of Maplewood. The next week, Linda stood inches away from an officer dealing with an actual emergency, a raccoon stuck in a trash can, dramatically declaring her First Amendment rights were being trampled when asked to step aside. It was exhausting. Jake tried to ignore them, hoping they would get bored and move on. But Patricia wasn't the type to back down. She was testing the waters, seeing just how far she could go. And every time she didn't face real consequences, she grew bolder. Then the Karens took their campaign of suburban tyranny to the next level. They weren't just complaining anymore. They were interfering. One morning, Jake was called to the local grocery store for a suspicious person. When he arrived, he found Patricia and her squad forming a semicircle around a bewildered teenage delivery driver. Linda, as always, had her phone up, live streaming the whole thing. "This man is loitering," Patricia announced, gesturing at the poor kid as if he were a dangerous fugitive. Jake sighed, already regretting his decision to respond. "MAAM, he's delivering groceries." Patricia folded her arms. "That's what he says. But how do we know he's not casing the neighborhood for a crime spree?" The kid looked at Jake, completely done with this situation. He held up a receipt. "I'm literally delivering her groceries," he said, pointing at Linda, who blinked in surprise. "Oh, well," she muttered, quickly lowering her phone. "That's beside the point." Jake pinched the bridge of his nose. "Go home, Patricia." She huffed but didn't push further. Not yet. The next incident was worse. The Karens had called for an emergency HOA meeting, gathering a confused crowd of residents who weren't even sure why they were there. Jake had barely stepped into the community center when Patricia clicked a button, revealing a PowerPoint presentation titled "The Oppression of Maplewood's Law-Abiding Citizens." The first slide was a blurry photo of Jake writing a parking ticket. "This," Patricia declared dramatically, "is what we are dealing with. A reign of tyranny." Silence. Someone coughed. A voice from the crowd finally spoke. "Patricia, you parked in a fire lane." Patricia ignored the interruption. "That's not the point." Linda, clearly confused, glanced at her notes. "Wait, I thought we were mad about the grocery guy?" Patricia quickly flipped to another slide, an image of Jake drinking coffee. "And this, taxpayer dollars funding lattes while we suffer." Jake frowned. "That's a gas station coffee." Patricia wasn't listening. "From this day forward, the Karen Coalition will take back our neighborhood. We will enforce the laws." Jake's eyes narrowed. "You can't do that." Patricia smirked. "Watch us." And with that, Maplewood's dumbest coup attempt was officially underway. The next morning, Patricia, Linda, Debbie, and Susan paraded through the streets wearing matching T-shirts that read Karen Neighborhood Patrol. They had even made their own badges, printed off the internet, and laminated at Staples. Then, they tried to make their first arrest. Mr. Reynolds, an 80-year-old retiree, had been taking his golden retriever for a walk when Patricia stepped in front of him, clipboard in hand. "You are under arrest," she declared. Mr. Reynolds frowned. "Excuse me? You're violating ordinance." She glanced at Susan. Susan flipped through her notes. Something about reckless endangerment? Jake arrived just in time to see Mr. Reynolds looking completely unimpressed while his dog, Duke, lay half asleep on the sidewalk. Jake crossed his arms. "Really?" Patricia nodded. This criminal was endangering the community. Jake looked at the snoring dog, then at Patricia, then back at the dog. "Carry on." Patricia beamed. "See? Even the officer agrees." Jake crouched and patted Duke's head. "Duke here looks pretty dangerous. Maybe he's running an underground dog fighting ring." Susan frowned. "Wait, is that sarcasm?" "Couldn't say." Jake stood up, his tone now flat. "But I can say that interfering with law enforcement is a real crime. And if you keep this up, you're going to find out what an actual arrest looks like." Patricia's smile faltered. "You wouldn't dare." Jake grinned. "Try me." Patricia glared at him, but she didn't argue. Not yet. But Jake knew the war wasn't over. No, this was just the beginning. Jake Carter had seen a lot of ridiculous things in his time as a cop, but nothing could have prepared him for the day. Patricia Whitmore and her self-proclaimed Karen coalition decided to arrest him. It started with a call from dispatch, though the barely suppressed laughter on the other end told him this wasn't a typical emergency. Carter, you're gonna want to get down to Maplewood Avenue." Jake rubbed his temples. "What now?" A pause. "Karen Patrol is attempting a traffic stop." He nearly choked on his coffee. "I'm sorry, what?" "Yeah, they've got flashing lights and everything. They've stopped some guy in a sedan." Jake floored it. When he arrived, he had to take a moment just to absorb the scene. In the middle of the road, blocking traffic, was a black SUV with cheap LED lights flashing. Slapped on the side was a homemade decal that read Karen Patrol, keeping Maplewood safe. Standing in front of a confused-looking man's car was Patricia, clipboard in hand, her expression smug as Linda recorded the entire fiasco. Debbie was off to the side, on the phone, probably updating the HOA about their so-called victory. Jake exhaled slowly, stepped out of his cruiser, and walked up to the scene. "Patricia, what the hell are you doing?" She turned, eyes gleaming with the unshakable confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences in her life. "Officer Carter, we are enforcing the law. Since the police in this town have failed us, we have taken it upon ourselves to ensure Maplewood remains safe." Jake stared at her, then at the man she had pulled over. He looked furious. "What exactly is he being stopped for?" Jake asked, already knowing he was going to regret it. Patricia flipped a page on her clipboard. "Speeding." The man threw up his hands. "I was going 28 in a 30. Patricia ignored him. "And I suspect his windows are tinted beyond legal limits." Jake glanced at the car. It was a completely standard sedan. The windows weren't tinted at all. "Move your car, Patricia." She planted her hands on her hips. "No, this is a legal stop, and I am conducting an investigation." Jake pulled out his ticket book. "Move your car, or I'll cite you for illegal obstruction of traffic." Patricia scoffed. "You wouldn't dare." Jake calmly started writing. "Illegal obstruction of traffic, unauthorized use of emergency lights, unlawful detainment of a civilian." He glanced up. "Should I keep going?" Linda gasped. "This is a violation of our rights." Jake ripped the ticket off and held it out to Patricia. "Take it and move your car, or I'll tow it." She snatched the paper from his hand like a child being scolded. "This isn't over." Jake chuckled. "I know." Patricia, humiliated but not defeated, took things even further. The very next morning, she stormed into the police station with Linda and Debbie in tow, slamming a cease and desist letter onto the chief's desk. "This is a formal demand for Officer Jake Carter to stand down. He is harassing law-abiding citizens and violating our constitutional rights." Chief Anderson didn't even look at the paper. "Patricia, this is a printed-out Facebook post." Patricia pursed her lips. Legal precedent must be upheld. Jake, watching from the doorway, stifled a laugh as Chief Anderson pinched the bridge of his nose. "You are not the police. You have zero authority. If you keep interfering, I will press charges for obstruction." Patricia looked personally offended. "You can't do that." "Yes, I can." Linda shoved her phone in his face. "I'm recording this." "Good," Chief Anderson said flatly. "Now get out." Patricia and her crew stormed out, but Jake knew they weren't done. That night, at precisely midnight, an emergency call came through. Multiple suspects attempting to enter the station. They're wearing matching shirts. Jake and his fellow officers rushed outside and found the entire Karen coalition standing in front of the police station, wearing shirts that read, "Justice for Maplewood, disband the police." Patricia stood at the front, megaphone in hand. "The police work for U.S. No more tyranny." Jake turned to his fellow officer. Is this a protest? The officer sighed. I think so. Linda walked through the crowd, dramatically live streaming. We are under siege. Our rights are being trampled. Jake sighed, rubbing his temples. All right, shut it down. He stepped forward, arms crossed. Ladies and gentlemen, as much as I appreciate the enthusiasm, you are trespassing on police property. Patricia spun around, triumphant. This is a public place. No, Jake said, pulling out his flashlight. This is police property, and it's after midnight. Leave now, or we'll have to remove you. Patricia turned to her followers. See, this is exactly what I mean. The government is silencing us. Jake nodded to his officers. All right, start clearing them out. Then the dumbest move in history happened. Patricia charged at Jake. Before he could react, she grabbed his badge and tried to rip it off his chest. Everything stopped. Linda gasped. Debbie screamed. Susan clutched her clipboard like a shield. Jake slowly tilted his head. Did you just attack a police officer? Patricia blinked. Then realization dawned on her face. Oh, before she could finish, Jake had her cuffed against the wall. I told you, he muttered, snapping the cuffs in place. Try me. As Patricia shrieked, Linda and Debbie wailed in horror, still recording. But it was too late. The Karen Revolution had officially failed spectacularly. Patricia Whitmore had spent the night in a holding cell, pacing like a caged animal. Her perfectly coiffed blonde bob was slightly frizzed, her pastel cardigan wrinkled, and her voice hoarse from the tirade she had delivered upon her arrest. She had expected no, demanded her immediate release. Instead, she had been met with the cold reality of due process. By the time morning rolled around, she was seething. Her lawyer, a weary-looking man who had clearly dealt with her antics before, managed to negotiate bail. When she finally walked out of the station, she expected a hero's welcome. Instead, she was met with Linda and Debbie, standing solemnly outside, clutching homemade justice for Patricia signs. The once mighty Karen coalition had dwindled to 2 exhausted foot soldiers. But Patricia had a plan. She had spent the night crafting her greatest weapon yet, the narrative. As soon as she got home, she recorded a dramatic, tear-filled video titled, Help, I was arrested for standing up to tyranny. It was an expertly edited masterpiece courtesy of Linda, conveniently cutting out the part where she lunged at Officer Carter. Instead, it painted her as a helpless victim, a suburban martyr in the battle against government oppression. Soft piano music played in the background. The words, Patricia's story matters, scrolled across the screen. Within hours, the video had gained traction. Not a lot of traction, but enough. Some outraged Facebook moms rallied to her cause. A few old HOA acquaintances left supportive comments. Someone even started a Defund the Karen Haters petition that racked up nearly 24 signatures, half of which were from Patricia under different usernames. But then, things took a turn. While Patricia was busy painting herself as the victim, the rest of Maplewood had had enough. 2 days after Patricia's release, an emergency HOA meeting was called. The turnout was massive. Nearly the entire neighborhood showed up, murmuring with anticipation. At the front of the room stood Mr. Thompson, the HOA president, a mild-mannered man who had spent years tolerating Patricia's nonsense. But now, his patience had run dry. He cleared his throat. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe we can all agree that certain members of our community have become a significant disturbance. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Patricia, seated in the front row with her arms crossed, scoffed, "This is a witch hunt." Mr. Thompson adjusted his glasses. For the first time in HOA history, we are moving for a formal expulsion of a resident from all HOA matters. Effective immediately, Patricia Whitmore is banned from attending meetings, making complaints, or interfering with neighborhood affairs. The room erupted. People clapped, cheered. Someone actually popped a bottle of champagne. Patricia shot to her feet, eyes blazing. "You can't do this. This is a violation of my rights, mister." Thompson met her glare with the calm of a man who had spent too many years listening to her complain about mailbox colors. "No, Patricia, this is called consequences." Her downfall didn't stop there. A week later, she finally had to face a judge for her multiple charges: trespassing, obstruction, and impersonating a law enforcement officer. Patricia arrived expecting to win. She had prepared a defense that included a 30-page printed-out document of legal precedents, a mix of internet conspiracy articles, a PowerPoint presentation titled "Why Officer Jake Carter Should Be Removed from Duty," and a list of grievances dating back 6 years, including "once looked at me rudely in a Starbucks." The trial lasted 15 minutes. The judge barely glanced at her papers before issuing a verdict: 200 hours of community service, a hefty fine, and a formal restraining order preventing her from interfering with police matters. Patricia was stunned. When she tried to argue, the judge simply raised a hand. "If you continue speaking, I will add contempt of court to your charges." She closed her mouth. Patricia's mugshot became public record, and someone, probably Jake, leaked it. Within hours, it was everywhere. The high school kids started printing it on T-shirts. Memes flooded local social media pages. A particularly popular one featured her furious expression with the caption, "When you try to arrest a cop and end up in jail instead." Her once loyal followers quickly distanced themselves. Linda abandoned activism and returned to making Facebook cooking videos. Debbie found a new scandal to obsess over. Even Susan, who had never been fully on board, quietly vanished from the chaos. Patricia tried to rebuild. She filed an appeal. It was denied. She called the local news. They laughed. She even tried to start a new Karen coalition, but the HOA had her permanently blacklisted. And then, finally, she vanished. For weeks, nobody saw her. Maplewood returned to peace. Jake continued his patrols, relishing the absence of pastel cardigans and entitled shrieking. Then, one morning, he got a text from an officer in the next county over. It was a photo of Patricia in handcuffs. The message read, "Is this one of yours? She just tried to fire our sheriff." Jake laughed for 5 minutes straight. Maplewood had changed. Without Patricia Whitmore's iron-fisted rule over the HOA and her squadron of self-important suburban enforcers, the neighborhood finally began to breathe again. The passive-aggressive complaints that once flooded City Hall slowed to a trickle. The community Facebook page, once a battleground of accusations and concerned citizen alerts, returned to what it was meant to be: lost pet notices, bake sale announcements, and the occasional debate over the best local pizza place. Officer Jake Carter, for the first time since arriving, felt something he hadn't experienced in months: peace. And yet, he knew it was only temporary. Patricia was gone, at least from Maplewood. But the thing about people like Patricia Whitmore, they don't learn, they don't change, they relocate. Jake had confirmed it the day he received that text from the next county over. The image of Patricia, in handcuffs yet again, standing outside a different police station, looking just as outraged and self-righteous as ever. The caption had been simple: "She just tried to fire our sheriff." Jake had laughed until his ribs hurt. With Patricia exiled, the rest of her squadron fell apart like a poorly built Jenga tower. Linda, once the self-proclaimed journalist of Maplewood, abandoned activism altogether. Her grand exposes on local corruption had been replaced with recipe videos on Facebook, where she demonstrated how to make 3-ingredient keto brownies. Nobody mentioned her Karen coalition days in the comments, though Jake suspected it was an unspoken rule to let her move on. Debbie, the neighborhood's gossip queen, did what she did best: she pivoted to a new scandal. Within weeks, she was deeply embroiled in HOA drama again, but this time, it was about someone's unapproved backyard gazebo. It wasn't quite as thrilling as a full-scale suburban coup, but it gave her something to do. Susan, the so-called legal expert who had been Patricia's right-hand woman, disappeared back into quiet obscurity. It was clear she had never been fully committed to Patricia's revolution in the first place. Without their fearless leader, the Karen coalition simply ceased to exist. Jake wasn't naive. He knew another Patricia would come along eventually. Entitlement wasn't something that disappeared, it just manifested in new ways, in new people. But for now, Maplewood was quiet. The streets were no longer patrolled by self-appointed law enforcers with laminated internet badges. The station hadn't received a single suspicious person report in weeks. One afternoon, as Jake sipped his coffee in the break room, a rookie officer asked him, "Do you think she'll ever come back?" Jake smirked. "Oh, she'll be back. Or at least someone like her will be." The rookie frowned. "You sound almost excited?" Jake chuckled, taking another sip of his coffee. "Let's just say I like having stories to tell." Because deep down, he knew the truth. The Karen Wars were never truly over. Not really. They were just on pause. For now.